issues in the Black Sea region. I'm delighted to see you / see your abbreviations on the screen. Just a couple of housekeeping points. If you can keep your mics off during the seminar, and if you want to ask questions, if you can use the chat function at the top of your screen in this meeting folder. You'll have to kind of go out into the calendar section. You'll find it there. Let us know if you ask a question in the chat function, whether you want to ask it live or if you want to read it out. And we'll do our best to make sure we get through all of the questions. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Debs. Debs.
Thanks, Tracy. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is what I did in my sabbatical presentation. And as you can see, my main research focus was on China's influence in the Black Sea region. So why have I chosen to look at China in the Black Sea region? Or why did I suppose, start this new research project? Well, there were three reasons. First, and perhaps most importantly, my interest in China was piqued by a Georgian student that I taught on last year's course, who did my MA special subject on maritime security in the Black Sea region. And for his presentation and his essay, he explored Georgia's relationship with China, Beijing's investment in Georgia, and what this might mean for security in the region. And while I'd looked and I'd been sort of keeping up to speed with what China was doing in Ukraine, I hadn't really given much thought as to China's role and influence in the Black Sea more generally, and what this might mean for security and stability in the region. So it was a good impetus towards getting into a new research area. And secondly, I wanted to look at China and its role in the Black Sea as it builds on my growing research interest into wider maritime issues and how these impact on security and defence in the region. In particular, I'm very interested in the importance of ports and maritime infrastructure in the Black Sea region, and as it turns out, so is China. So that made sense actually to look at China's growing interest in ports and maritime infrastructure, as it was something that I was increasingly recognising was important for my study of maritime power and maritime issues more generally in the region. And lastly, looking at China allows me to further build my research profile as an expert in security and defence in the Black Sea region. And also I realised very quickly when I started going with my research on this subject that there wasn't anything published that systematically explored China's role and influence in the Black Sea region and what this means for security. As such, I feel that I'm hoping my research fills an important gap in the literature on Black Sea studies. So as a brand new research area for me, it was difficult in many ways to know where to start. So I started by looking at China's interest in the Black Sea region, why this region mattered to Beijing, before then examining the level and focus of Chinese investment and engagement with each of the 6 Black Sea littoral states, which is my usual focus when I look at the Black Sea. Although I'm very cognizant of the fact that many analysts take their analysis wider and look at many of the other non-littoral states. In essence, I wanted to really understand what was going on in the region. In the course of my research and the subsequent writing of my article, Imaginatively, I find that China had become an increasingly important actor in the region, and this looks set to continue in the future. The caveat here, though, is that when I wrote my article, it was just as the pandemic was kind of taking off, something that I returned to later in my presentation. So a lot of my assumptions are based on pre-COVID-19. In relation to China's general interest in the Black Sea region, the Belt and Road Initiative is key. The Belt and Road Initiative is made up of two elements: the Overland Silk Road Economic Belt, which relies on railways and land connections, and the sea-based Maritime Silk Road, which connects China through a series of ports and development along a route following the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Med, and of course into the Black Sea as well. For China, as you all know, the Belt and Road Initiative, it's about competitive connectivity. It's about unlocking foreign markets to allow China to externalise its overcapacity problems through export, supporting its domestic companies, and with an aim of gaining a market share in new sectors. And to achieve these objectives, China has adopted a strategy of engaging with any receptive country in the Black Sea region interested in expanding economic relations. The Black Sea region then is seen by China as an important way of securing access to vital European markets. And that while only two of the Black Sea littoral states, Bulgaria and Romania, are part of the now 17+1 framework, which was set up by China with Eastern European states to increase this interconnectivity and access European markets. When I looked at my research, all 6 littoral states have engaged to varying degrees with China under the Belt and Road Initiative. And as a result, the growing number of Chinese investments in the Black Sea region suggests a complex entanglement in the region. As China's influence grows, I believe it will become an increasingly important actor in the Black Sea. So, in conducting my research, I found that of all of the Black Sea littoral states, Georgia has been the most active in securing Chinese investment. Georgia has actively encouraged Chinese investment, mainly as a way of developing its economy and balancing Russian influence and interference. Georgia's primary importance to China is as a transportation and logistics hub linking Asia to Europe via the Belt and Road Initiative. The Georgian government has plans to develop its maritime infrastructure along its Black Sea coast, making Georgia's ports an integral part of Beijing's maritime network. The biggest project, beset by huge problems, however, has been the plan to create a deep water port in Anaklia, which you can see on the top picture. This port is really important as it would enable Georgia to receive Panamax container ships. These are the container ships of choice for shipping companies. And the development of this deep water port in Anaklia would significantly increase Georgia's importance to China. Georgia currently doesn't have a deep water port, so this would be a real plus for Georgia. My research has also shown that both Ukraine and Bulgaria have benefited from Chinese investment, but these have not been without their challenges and controversies, which I discuss in my article. Chinese investment in Ukraine, for instance, has increased significantly over the last few years. China not only sees Ukraine as an attractive logistics transit hub within the Belt and Road Initiative, but also as a really important market for agricultural imports to China, in particular corn, sunflower oil and soybeans. As a result, China is now Ukraine's largest single national trading partner, pushing Russia into second place. However, while relations have deepened, particularly in the agricultural sector, more controversially, China has also turned its attention to Ukraine's defence industry, with the attempt to acquire Motorsic, which is one of the world's leading manufacturers of helicopter engines and parts for civilian and military aircraft. In light of this attempted Chinese takeover, the security services of Ukraine have launched an investigation alleging that this was an enemy sabotage plot, and the case is currently under review. So there's ups and downs when you look at the individual states. I also found that Romania, on the other hand, has adopted a very cautious approach to Beijing, prioritising security and economic relations with the US and the EU, viewing relations with Beijing more through a geopolitical lens than some of the other states in the Black Sea region. The last state I looked at, of course, is Turkey. And in examining Turkey, my research also showed that Turkish-Chinese cooperation has been slow to start and beset by political difficulties. In particular, over Chinese policy towards the Uyghur community. But cooperation does look set to increase in the near future in light of Turkey's strained and difficult relations with the West. So this is part of Turkey repackaging and reorientating, perhaps slightly more towards Russia and towards China in light of, as I've said, very difficult relations with both the EU and the US. So what were my other findings? Well, one of my findings, perhaps unsurprisingly, was that the most important factor shaping Beijing's engagement with and influence in the Black Sea region is its relationship with the Russian Federation. Despite Moscow's initial suspicions about the Belt and Road Initiative, Russia has begun to work closely with China to advance their mutual interest in what Moscow sees as its near abroad, the former Soviet states. To facilitate this cooperation, the Chinese leadership have adopted a very low-key friction path that is sensitive to Russia's regional ambitions and security concerns in the region. So rather than joining the Belt and Road Initiative, Russia has suggested harmonising it with Russia's own integration initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, which, as you all know, has Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan as members. Perhaps most importantly of all for Moscow, the merging of these two initiatives will mean that the former Soviet republics, at least those I've just mentioned in the Eurasian Economic Union, will not have to choose between Beijing or Moscow, at least in the short term, which is quite an advantage for them. My article also argues, however, that problems are likely to emerge in this relationship between China and Russia, which could impact on the Black Sea region. The relationship between China and Russia is, of course, an asymmetrical one in many areas. Not only is China Russia's biggest trading partner, but due to sanctions and its increasing isolation, Moscow has become increasingly reliant on Beijing politically. And as a result of this asymmetry, China will continue to tread carefully in the Black Sea region. Nonetheless, it's very clear that China will protect and advance its own economic interests despite Moscow's sensitivity. One of my research questions that I also addressed in my article, which came out of my sabbatical period, was the effect of Chinese engagement in the Black Sea region on security and stability, and this was much harder. My research indicates that while China's interest in Georgia are primarily economic, there are hopes that increasing Chinese investment could bring security guarantees and an important counterweight to its larger neighbour, the Russian Federation. The hope is that an increase in Chinese economic investment in Georgia could prevent Russia from using military aggression in the future, as such action might risk damaging Beijing's economic investments. In essence, Chinese engagement provides potential security benefits to Georgia and could change Russia's strategic calculus by increasing the cost of destabilising its neighbours. One of the most important aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Chinese documentation is to ensure stability. They don't make the mistake of suggesting that is synonymous with democracy for obvious reasons, but they are very keen on the idea of stability. So that was one of the areas that I thought might be important when looking at Georgia. In addition, my research also indicates that increased Chinese investment in Ukrainian ports, in particular in the highly contested and politicized Sea of Azov, could go some way to mitigating tensions between Moscow and Kiev. Tensions have been particularly high, of course, since the construction of the Russian bridge across the Kerch Straits in 2017. Russian border guards have been inspecting and delaying most ships entering the Sea of Azov, in particular those heading to Ukrainian ports, particularly the ports of Mariupol and Berdansk. You can see Mariupol on the map on your left. And tensions, as you remember, reached boiling point when Russian border guards rammed Ukrainian ships heading into the Sea of Azov in late 2018 and arrested 24 sailors. So this is a part of the Black Sea that is particularly full of tension, particularly contested between Russia and Ukraine. Despite these tensions, the Chinese food processing company has signed a memorandum of understanding to develop port infrastructure in Mariupol. Under this agreement, COFCO will construct docking sites, construct a second stage for port grain terminal in Mariupol, and will create an entire transshipment complex for agricultural products, something that's very important to China. I think that Chinese investment in Ukrainian ports in the Sea of Azov may well therefore encourage Russian restraint, both at sea and on land, in Ukraine's ongoing conflict against the Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass. Russia will be less willing to antagonize its new best friend, China, by holding up maritime traffic, particularly Chinese traffic coming out of the Sea of Azov. And Beijing's presence in the east of Ukraine, in Mariupol, a few miles from the conflict in the east, could again change Moscow's strategic calculus with regard to its support for the separatists. I suspect that's probably too ambitious, but I think anything which goes towards encouraging Russia to find a peaceful, long-term solution to the conflict in the Donbass has to be a good thing. And it'd be interesting to see if China is willing to play a role. My research also indicated that while the level of Chinese investment varies tremendously in the Black Sea, Beijing is likely to further increase its presence in the region. In my article, I argue this can be explained by three factors. Caveat before COVID-19. The first factor estimates that global freight demand will increase or will triple by 2050. With ships expected to carry more than 3/4 of all goods, ports in the Black Sea region will become even more important to China. So that's one reason. Secondly, an increase in maritime traffic in the Black Sea will be facilitated by the planned building of the giant canal Istanbul by the Turkish government. This 45-kilometre canal is an artificial sea level waterway that will connect the Black Sea to the Med and is projected to have a capacity of 160 vessels a day, a similar volume of traffic that travels through the Bosphorus. Despite considerable public support, public opposition, I should say, and environmental concerns, the plan for this canal has been approved and it looks like it's going to go ahead, giving China, if it does, increased access to the Black Sea. A third factor that I came across when I looked at China's potential for growth in the Black Sea is that some of the Black Sea littoral states will move from lower middle income to upper middle income status over the next few years. The World Bank has predicted that as Ukraine transitions from lower to upper middle income status, there will be an increase in containerized trade, maritime trade, to meet growing demands. Giving a clear indication of this upward trend, the Ukrainian container market grew by more than 20% in 2019. So where's my research into China and the Black Sea likely to go in the future? Well, my research has opened up two further related research areas, one of which I'm currently working on, and the second I'll begin later this year as more research is conducted and is published on the impact of COVID-19 on the Chinese economy and those of the Black Sea states, and of course, maritime freight and transport into the Black Sea. On the back of my research so far, I'm currently examining in more detail the impact of China's increasing engagement in the Black Sea region. There's no doubt that the research indicates that China has become a more assertive and self-confident global economic power with a more proactive role in international affairs through its promotion of the Belt and Road Initiative, and has been more forceful in defending its interests. This has also been true in the Black Sea region. So in light of Russia's growing political and economic influence, my next article will examine the extent to which the littoral Black Sea states will be forced to choose between the US and China in the future, and what this will mean for security and stability. So in this forthcoming article, I argue that as the relationship between the US and China has deteriorated, the Black Sea states have increasingly found themselves caught between two poles. The West, led by the US, and to a lesser extent the EU, as opposed to a more powerful and self-confident China in the East. This article then I'm currently struggling with and writing examines the choices some of the Black Sea littoral states face in continuing to cooperate with China, given the current state of relations between their main security provider, the US, and of course, China. I argue that given China's growing influence in the Black Sea region, many of the Black Sea littoral states might find themselves caught in the crossfire between China and the US, and will be increasingly forced to choose their economic as opposed to their security interests. After completing this article, my next research project will look at the impact of the coronavirus and the impact that's likely to have on Chinese investment and engagement in the Black Sea region. One of my assumptions here is that if the Chinese economy can recover after the virus, then there's a very real possibility that the level of Chinese investment in the Black Sea region will increase further. Many of the smaller Black Sea states struggling in light of the coronavirus with an economic downturn or even recession could be more vulnerable to Chinese penetration. This is something I'll explore in a future article. That's it. That's the end of my presentation. I'd be delighted to have any comments or questions.
Deborah, hello. Sorry, Zeno, I came in late because I was in another webinar. I was wondering if you could say or repeat, if you said that already, to what extent China is protecting these investments and how?
Yeah, I suppose China's protecting its investments by developing very close relationships with each of the states. So it's doing what Russia does and what the US does as well, I suppose. It's developing bilateral relations so that it can ensure that it's able to influence the states one of the problems I think in the Black Sea region is there isn't much multilateralism. So the Black Sea states can't really work together and gang up against China. It's very easy to pick them off individually. So China's adopted as I said, a very bilateral approach to the Black Sea, while recognizing that actually it's an important domain for maritime issues. It hasn't done anything more than that in terms of protecting its interests. But I think, what will be really interesting to watch over the next year to 2 years is the extent to which China begins to use its muscle, its economic muscle, in light of the COVID-19 on what are quite fragile states in the Black Sea. So the extent to which China will persuade not weak governments, but certainly strong governments in Georgia and Ukraine, but who are facing a lot of financial challenges, the extent to which it will be able to persuade them to adopt more pro-Chinese approaches to their foreign policy. There's been no sign of that yet, but that could be something that I will keep my eyes peeled for.
Thank you. It's interesting that, for example, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, you see this CEEC, coalition of countries which are politically very close to China, and yet China hasn't really invested anything in those countries. So it's bizarre. But I guess maybe these countries are hoping to get something in the future, and maybe this is something a dynamic that we will see also in other states, in those that you're looking for.
Yeah, good points. I found that obviously I'm not an expert on the Balkans, but when looking at this now 17 plus framework that was set up by China, which I mentioned in my presentation, it seems very clear to me that despite the hype that China was about to launch lots of initiatives, lots of foreign direct investment into the Balkans, Montenegro, Bosnia, a lot of the states that of course aren't EU members but are very close to Europe, that actually the level of foreign direct investment doesn't begin to match what we've seen in Europe in terms of Germany and the UK and some of the other European states. So I think that China perhaps has promised a lot but hasn't been quite so good in coming forward with goods. So China's very good at picking off the industries that it thinks is important to China. And of course, that doesn't always tally with what a lot of the East European, Balkan, Black Sea states necessarily want from Chinese investment.
Thank you. I'll let the others talk. I think there is sorry.
Yeah, Debs, there's a question. Can you see the chat? There's a question from Greg about the possible collision of US and Chinese maritime interests in the region.
Oh, interesting. Very timely, I suppose, given that China seems to be stepping up its antics in the South China Sea at the moment in light of COVID, that actually there are legitimate concerns, I guess, as to the extent to which the Black Sea could become a new theatre of concern. And I think it's really unlikely because, as I said in my presentation, because of the close relationship between China and Russia, China has been willing to cede the Russian Federation, as I said, the leadership role in the region, and that includes in the maritime sphere as well. And China, at the moment, apart from its commercial traffic going in and coming out of the Black Sea, has no military invested interests in the Black Sea. And I think that's probably unlikely to change in the short to medium term. And I think, of course, that's compounded by the problem of the Montreux Convention, which limits the transit of military vessels into the Black Sea. Having said that, though, I think what's really interesting for me, maybe because I'm a bit geeky, is that the Canal Istanbul, or the canal that the Turks are looking at building would circumvent the Montreal Convention, which is really interesting because it would mean that military traffic could come into the Black Sea without the restrictions on tonnage and time, which are the current restrictions. So there would be nothing wrong with the Chinese visiting some of the littoral states and engaging in training exercises, and even, I suppose, supporting some of the littoral states, because the vessels could certainly sail through the Canal Istanbul over the next 10 years, probably. So I think that that's quite an interesting angle for me. Will China get involved militarily or in terms of its maritime power in the Black Sea? I really don't think so. I think it's highly unlikely. It doesn't have, well, how do you say it, a dog in the game? I want to say a cat in the game, but that's the wrong terminology. Dog in the fight. It hasn't got that. So I think it's unlikely. But having said that, I think that given that China is very keen on playing a global role, then it seems to me that global maritime powers are very keen on presence operations. So who's to say in 5 or 10 years' time that the Chinese Navy doesn't think about presence operations and showing the flag more in the Black Sea, particularly if they have these economic investments. So yeah, I think your question raises some really interesting issues for me as a maritime expert as well. So thank you for that. Yay.
Debs, can I ask a follow-on to that then, regarding China and the military? Because we've obviously China's been increasing its presence across Central Asia, and everyone thought, okay, the division of power in Central Asia is Russia does security, China does economics. But in the last few years, we've seen a growing kind of military investment from China there, particularly in terms of arms sales, but also few kind of security bases popping up. And I wonder if we'll see that moving forwards as it seeks to protect its investments in the Black Sea region. Or whether you think actually, and I know you were just talking about it, longer term, the Black Sea is more closed, and it's further away geographically. I just wonder what your thoughts are.
I think that's really interesting because I think if you compare Central Asia or look at Central Asia, I suppose, as a potential testing ground, to look at the extent to which Chinese engagement, the shape and how it might change, then the logical extension, I suppose, of Chinese increasing engagement in Central Asia, as you said, economic and perhaps more security, military based, is that could be mirror imaged in the Black Sea. I think it's probably unlikely because it's still seen predominantly as Russia's backyard, and of course NATO as well, with Romania, Bulgaria and Turkey as NATO members. But I'm very cautious about making predictions about what China will do in the future. And personally, I think it would be very beneficial for the Black Sea states to actually have China as more of a counterweight to the Russian Federation, and even perhaps to balance off a little bit against the US and the degree of US influence in the Black Sea as well. So I think it would be very interesting to watch, and it would probably throw quite an interesting spanner into the works in terms of security and stability in the Black Sea region if China did go down that track, which is done with Central Asia. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks, Debs. Can you see Andrew's put up a question? I don't know if you can see it.
No.
He's got, in fact, 2 questions. Okay, shall I read them out? It says, many thanks for the presentations. 2 questions, if I may. Which journal is your piece in? And second, what sorts of empirical data have you used, particularly on the Chinese side? Ooh.
Thanks, Andy. What have I done? Oh, well, I've sent my article off to Southeastern Europe and Black Sea Studies. as I was going to send it to Mediterranean Quarterly, but they've gone out of business. Who knew? Which was a bit disappointing, as they've tended to like my work in the past. I sent it off a month ago, and the editor approved it to be sent out to the reviewers. So I'm hoping for some glowing reviews coming back. I think it's an interesting piece of work. I don't know if it quite touches exactly what the journal wants, but you've got to keep your fingers crossed, I guess. Empirical sources were far easier on the Black Sea than they were on China. And obviously I don't speak Chinese. And obviously, as I've said, this is a new area for me. So the only empirical sources that I could really get my hands on in terms of China were looking at China's, what China's published on the Belt and Road Initiative, and what it says about what it wants to achieve in the Belt and Road Initiative, what Chinese official sources have said, newspapers and I guess government sources have said about their relationship with Black Sea countries. So it was much harder to find good empirical or good hard-nosed, I guess, research into China. But I think I found enough to be able to build up a number of arguments. What was more fun was finding the empirical research on the Black Sea. As I said, I'm very excited about issues to do with ports and infrastructure and development as part of my interest in the maritime domain. And I found that there's a couple of top shelf publications, and I'm only joking, quite sad websites and publications which look at port strategy and look at some of the detail that I'm interested in terms of what China's been doing with port development and maritime infrastructure in the Black Sea. So that was very rich, a very rich vein for me to tap into, and something I enjoyed very much.
Thanks, Debs. Are there any other questions out there that people want to ask live? I can't see anything. There's nothing in the meeting chat.
Deborah, sorry, have you had a chance to look at China's private army protecting the Belt, the Silk Road, or protecting the Belt and Road Initiative, something like that?
No, I haven't seen it. Should we talk offline? Do you want to send me stuff and we can talk about it? Because that would be really useful to my research.
Yeah, maybe it's not on your case. It's more for the review of the literature or whatever, but maybe it's useful.
Okay. No, thank you. That's really helpful.
And sometimes I was at another webinar and somebody asked, because China basically, Chinese military expenditures, they went up 20 times over the last 20 years, roughly. And so somebody said, oh, but what do they want to do with that? I think it's unfair to say that at this stage that they want to like dominate Europe or something like that, but I think it's fair to think that, as you argue, that the more they grow, the more they will need to protect those investments. Especially as we were talking about the Gulf today, and the United States is obviously militarily still patrolling those choke points. And yet, when there was the crisis between Britain and Iran, Pompeo was a bit upset with Britain and said, "You have to do more. You need to take care of your own ships." And so, China at some point might step in, maybe in multilateral efforts to fill that gap. I don't think there is a gap yet, but
okay.
I think there is a trend, and I wonder maybe this applies to other regions as well. Just some thoughts.
Thanks, Zeno. That's interesting. It mirrors what Tracy was saying, in that what I probably need to do, and I've only just begun this project, is to cast my net wider and look at what China's been doing in other parts of the world, particularly Central Asia, because that's really important because of its close proximity to the Black Sea, but also to cast my net wider, as you've suggested, to look at whether or not there are precedents to what China's been doing in other regions. for the Black Sea and incorporate that into my research. So that's a really helpful heads up for me. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any more questions out there?
I think Andrew is speaking.
Hello. Follow up. It's your comment, Debs. It's worth looking at Africa and how China's working in Africa, because it's not just the ports that you and what rail works you're looking at. Look also at their work with railways, because they're using in Africa. They're starting to do a big railway program linking to their ports. And if you want more stuff on China, like you, I've got no Chinese to me. It's worth looking at what the Chinese academics are saying, because sometimes the state uses the academics as a way of flying kites on the different debates. So it's worth having a look at the different debates within the Chinese academia, and quite a few of them are actually English based. So you get a sense of a feeling for what the Chinese government's thinking by what its academics say.
Oh, that's really useful, Andy, and particularly your point about Africa, because one of the interesting things is that the Turks are looking at developing their rail network with the Chinese. So it'll be interesting to see what they've been doing, the Chinese been doing in Africa, in terms of what that might mean for Turkey as well. And I hadn't realised about the academics, so thank you, that's useful.
That's okay. I mean, the big one they've done so far in railways is Djibouti to Addis.
Wow. I suppose what that raises, though, one of the interesting issues which I need to incorporate into my research as well is the issue of debt. And it links in with what Zeno was saying about influence as well. And one of the concerns I know in Africa has been that actually a lot of states have got themselves, and Asia, have got themselves into debt. And while that's not quite the case in the Black Sea, it could increasingly become the case in light of COVID-19. When governments are short of funds, they're looking for Chinese investment. So I think that debt might be an interesting one for me to look at in terms of whether or not that increases Chinese ability to exert influence over the individual littoral states.
They certainly do it in the Pacific with the debt levels in the Pacific vis-a-vis the South China Sea. So you don't get condemnation of China because of the amount of debt that a lot of the Pacific Islands now owe to China.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it's China's always seen as very attractive to lots of states. Probably a bit less true in the Black Sea, although it was true before President Zelensky was elected in Ukraine, because the Chinese are not particularly, they don't put quite the ties on their foreign direct investment that lots of other states and organizations do. You don't have to engage in corruption, anti-corruption, you don't have to engage in democracy, civic society development. All of the ties and the conditions that are laid out aren't laid out by the Chinese. So I can see why China is quite a useful source of foreign direct investment for many states, and also was for Ukraine for a long time for those reasons.
Deborah, sorry, just to go back to protecting the BRI, what you were saying before about China looking for partnerships. I think if they look at previous empires, they certainly, if they've learned the lesson, they will probably look more at the American hegemony than past empires, because it's much cheaper to project military forces or security forces through alliances. Although on the other hand, there is a limit to that, because one day they might shift, your allies might shift sides. So I wonder, I'm just guessing whether they will follow that model. Although it's not extremely easy. I'm seeing, I don't know if I have up-to-date information, but until 1 or 2 years ago, those governments like Pakistan, Myanmar, that are in the string along the string of pearls, they were not so keen on they actually said publicly that they don't want the Chinese military there. They just wanted to clarify that. I don't know if this is still the case, but I don't know. It's not easy either to find these military allies.
Thanks, Dino. I think your point about, I suppose, what model the Chinese might adopt to increase their influence is an interesting one for me to ponder. And I probably agree with you. I think it's more likely to be an American model than a British model. Thank you. Are we drying up? I won't take it personally, by the way.
Well, Greg said that he's thanked you and he's off to make lunch for His Majesty, he says, which I'm assuming is Alex.
As opposed to Prince Philip.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, you never know. If there are there any other questions out there? Because we've poor Debs has been taking questions for half an hour or so. If there aren't any more.
That's very interesting.
Okay.
So yeah, just to thank you for your presentation, Debs. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys, and thanks for turning up, and thanks for your comments. Actually, been really, really helpful. Get me thinking about this new research area for me and things I might think about in the future.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debs. It's really good. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah.
Bye.
Oh,
Thanks.
Debs, one last thought. Look at China Aid. Look where China Aid puts its money and where they go.
Okay.
They're
it's
different.
the same way like British aid, where we do.
Yeah, it's their official version of differed, but I think it's linked interestingly how much they go to where they want to invest.
Okay. Oh yeah. Thank you. That would be an interesting barometer as well.
Yeah.
Good.
I have
Thanks,
no idea what
everyone.
they've done in that region, but they're all over Africa at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Thanks, Debs.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, Deb.
Bye.
Thanks, Debs. Thanks for sorting out all the PowerPoint.